Welcome to our discussion today on how COVID-19 has impacted low-income housing tax credits. My name is Christina Apostolides, and I am a partner with Novogradic and Company. We specialize in providing public accounting, tax, compliance, and consulting services to clients in the affordable housing and community development industries. Joining me today, we have talented and dedicated industry members who will share their experiences from the beginning of the pandemic to where the industry is today, and will give their guidance to prepare for the uncertain future. We will be focusing the discussion on COVID-19's effect on structuring LIHTC deals, including demand and pricing, and how investors and developers dealt with the delays, changes, and uncertainties of 2020. So first with us, we have Blanca Ramirez, who as VP of Acquisitions and Underwriting with Hudson Housing Capital, focuses in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, tri-state area affordable housing market. Hudson Housing has consistently raised and closed over $600 million per year. Next, we have Michelle Yarbrough-Korb, a shareholder with Buchanan, Ingersoll and Rooney, who represents developers and public housing agencies on development, utilization of low-income housing tax credits, and federal programs, including HUD. Also with us today, we have Gail Manganello, Senior VP at PNC. Gail manages the nationwide origination group for PNC's equity and debt LIHTC real estate platform. PNC funds approximately $1 billion annually for the development of affordable housing. So thank you for our panelists for joining us today. Although there's much of 2020 we would all like to forget, we know that we can always learn from our past. So today, our panelists are going to take a trip down memory lane of 2020. So to our panelists, thinking back to March of 2020, when March started off sort of normal, and then all of a sudden things kind of took a turn. What effect did the pandemic have on existing deals? And that's how we're going to start our panel. Just kind of, we're going to take it from early pandemic to mid pandemic and current, and then thinking about the future. So I'm going to turn it over to Blanca first to give us her thoughts and her memories and kind of how the pandemic affected the work she was doing at that time.
Thanks, Christina. Such an interesting way to start a panel, right? You only see the presenters. But thanks to the Housing Alliance and for everybody who's joining us today. So going back to, I guess, well, at least March 13th was my last day in my office. And since then, I've been working remotely, which I think is also the world and the world that we worked in and still work in. And how that's affected, this industry. It's interesting. I think, I think a lot of projects, I think the intention for syndicators, investors, and developers was to continue doing the great work we do for many good reasons. It's really, housing, of course, has become at the forefront, and most importantly, for individuals during this time who are going through difficult time, finding affordable housing is key. So I think that was the initial take, but then there was the reality of what that meant in the world that we were living in, meaning that many offices across the state and Pennsylvania, as well as other states, moved to remote work, and those changes had to be put in place, which I think that added to a lot of the delays in some of these projects actually getting started or closing into construction, or even being able to secure financing. I think also those that were under construction saw some delays because some stop work was put out there where, construction sites had to be closed down. And even when they opened up, there were delays in getting supplies and materials to finish a project. And every locality had their own kind of gear up of where construction would be. And lease up became interesting because now we had to figure out how to lease up a building with, be socially distanced and being social distance, and how would that get done? How would you get the required information from the potential tenant, resident? And, it just became an interesting an interesting time in our work, in our industry. And just to speak a little more specifically to investors, I think they all still very committed to get their projects done. I mean, I didn't have, knock on wood, any investor turn away from any project that was already signed up in pipeline. And many of them are still on the project today, as they are still closing many of these projects that were signed up pre-COVID. So in that sense, things didn't change too much. It just took a little bit longer to get there. But I don't want to take all the time. I'm sure Gail and Michelle have fun things to add.
Gail, from your perspective as well, let's hear maybe how you experienced that time frame, again, from PNC and working with various investors as well.
Sure, thank you. So yes, going into March, we had actually, were having a really nice start to the year. Deals were flowing, construction starts were happening, lease up was happening, completions were happening, and we were in sort of our normal routine of thinking about what this year is going to look like, what our marketing efforts were going to be, what our goals were, and so forth. And then yes, March happened, and it was a period of adjustment. As Blanca said, there were a lot of things that had to be thought out. Primarily, how can we all continue on in this industry and with this business working from home? But as we talked about as a group, this industry has pivoted. Since inception, since 1986, we are always encountering pivots, right? Whether it be tax reform, whether it be potential sunsetting, whether it be limitations on allocations and so forth. We do a great job pivoting. So while initially the thought was we are going to see some huge delays, some not only in lease up and construction completion, but just on the supply chain and so forth, we didn't see as much of that. So I think as an industry, we all pivoted very quickly to working remotely. There was an adjustment period, as there always is. Things slowed down for April, May, and June, for sure. But we all learned how to do virtual site visits. We learned how to have virtual showings for lease ups for anticipated tenants. Our community became very communicative. Our developers were addressing situations immediately. They were extremely responsive. The agencies were responsive. The lenders pivoted. So it was an adjustment, and it does take some time. And we saw deals in all stages of just being signed up to being under construction to being under lease up and also trying to stabilize. And there was a slow period, but we've adjusted and we've pivoted, and we'll talk a little bit later about what that looks like now.
Great, thank you. And Michelle, from the developer side, because that's where you focus on, and what were your developers thinking, and were they afraid, concerned? What challenges did you have to help them through during that period? What kind of phone calls were you getting?
Sure. So I guess if we go to Pennsylvania and sort of the context, right? These were July 2019 reservations. They needed to close by the end of May per PHFA's deadline. So I think in March, there was a fair level of panic already among developers thinking, how am I going to get there? How am I going to close within PHFA's required timeframe? And then COVID happened. So I think the very first calls I got were where some of the contractors, even before there was a construction shutdown in Pennsylvania, had walked off jobs, either things that were already under construction. They were getting a notice, we're walking off the job. And then I had deals where contractors had walked off a job. And so then they're giving deals that yet to close notice, hey, we've walked out our current jobs, our timeline, our schedule, our availability of manpower is shifted. We don't know that we can keep to your construction schedule going forward. And then that got further complicated by the fact that we were one of the jurisdictions that determined construction was non-essential. And so we sort of went on a 45-day hiatus where there was no construction, but we didn't know it was going to be roughly 45 days. We didn't know how long this was going to go on for. So deals were sort of hesitant to move forward, but I was fortunate enough to be on the team of that one and only deal in Pennsylvania that closed in April before PHFA's original time frame. And I think it largely had to do with just the trusting your partners. In that deal, there was a great relationship between the developer and the general contractor where they felt confident that, as soon as they were allowed to be on site, that they'd, navigate any kind of COVID procedures and make it happen and be able to stick to a time frame. And then also sort of the lenders and the syndicator and investor had been involved with this developer before. And I think, we largely closed on faith and trust that we were going to work it out. So, as the lawyer, I always want everything to be in writing to protect my client. So we did, for the first time in a long time, really focus on force majeure and what does that look like? And we were sort of all over the map, but we got comfortable, that we could weather the storm, force majeure could come into play. We could still, make tax credit deadlines and things will work. At this point, the documents, other than force majeure, didn't really change a whole lot from what we had been doing previously. I can talk later about some of the changes that rolled in over time. And, from a PHFA standpoint, we were again kind of closing on trust. People were getting emails from Holly Glosser, who's since retired, and other folks within the agency to give them some comfort that, if a credit swap needed to happen, if we were going to misplace in service, that somehow this was all going to work out. So when we agreed to close in April, we did not know construction moratorium was being lifted. And so, I think kudos to all the parties who just kind of said, we're going to make this work and move forward. So that was really the early days of how it was moving, at least from the developer side.
Yeah, and I think with a lot of how the LIHTC program and is administered by the states, it's so important to know your state. And then now with the pandemic, just these other construction rules and rental housing rules and moratoriums on evictions, a lot of it's dictated by the locality that you're in. So I don't know if you guys encountered other differences in working in different states or things specific that might people need to watch out for as these things kind of hit us unexpectedly.
As much what I was going to say, as much as every state's a little bit different, I think generally, the delays, everything we've talked about was across the board, right? It's just depended, on how, projects decided to close. Like I closed a project in another state in April, and I think, the deal itself, for the most part, remained the same. I just think I think along the lines of what Michelle was saying, we looked a lot more at these documents, and the investor also looked a lot more at those reserves and cushions, and and it was a lot of honest conversation between developer, syndicator, and investor, with concerns of delays and what that would mean for a project. And I think, what exactly transformed from those conversations may be different from state to state and project by project. But for the most part, I think, they just made everything longer. But I think that everybody was invested in getting these projects closed as well. I think that was key. And I think, as Michelle mentioned, these relationships are really important and made such a big difference in these conversations. And I think, you know, a lot of investors were looking at that and looking at their who they would work with, you know, in future projects, you know, and new deals that they would sign up during these COVID times with when things were really uncertain and the unknown of, you know, would construction stop again? Would, you know, would credits be delayed and so on and so forth? I think a lot of investors look to those they've done a lot of work with and those who they've had relationships with and trusted to some extent to be able to get that done.
Great. Yeah, definitely that experience.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I agree. You know, across the board, states did react a little differently. It was considered critical need construction in some states and not in others, and we just had to work with what we had there. You know, the other big thing that was being considered at the time was PPP loans and forbearance, and that was really the topic of discussion early on. And the anticipation is that that was going to consume most of our time. My group went through training on PPP loans. We went through and tried to figure out what forbearance meant really on a LIHTC deal and how that would affect the LIHTC deal and so forth. So we spent a lot of time early on, you know, not just trying to work with the states and figure out what the states were going to be able to do, but also what the lenders were going to be doing and asking and what the possibilities were to help alleviate the potential issues we saw coming down the line. So we spent a lot of time doing that. And, you know, fortunately for us, what we saw was that even though we had, you know, over, you know, between April and September, we had over 600 requests, special requests from our partners. Half of those were on construction and lease up, and the other half were special requests, such as releasing reserves or delaying funding of replacement reserves and other reserves, just to provide for the anticipation that there may be a need further on down the line. We don't have it right now, we're at the very beginning, but down the line, we want to preserve for what may happen. And that's what many of the discussions were during this March to June period.
Right. We saw that with a lot of our clients. We kept checking in. How are you doing? How are you doing? And in the beginning, they're like, we're still okay, you know, but they're like, we think, you know, we're not going to collect on rents at some point, but right now we're okay. And it lasted for a while. You know, I think that, you know, everybody was under anticipation of, you know, a big crash or something, but and cash flow issues, but you're right. Great. And then also, so we touched a little bit on deals, you know, that were already closed or under closing. You know, how much activity did you see during that time period of maybe new deals coming in and new deal closings? I know we talked about maybe there's a little bit of slowdown, but were there things still happening in that March to June time period? And were investors already being able to, you know, have that time, you know, that mindset of, okay, COVID's happening, what changes were they kind of pushing down on you and then down to the developers?
Well, I'll start. March was our second biggest month this year for signing new business. And that typically happens when there's a shift in the industry. And all those LOIs that we were negotiating, all of a sudden, you know, it was get signed now, or we're not sure what it's going to look like in 30, 60, 90 days. So March, we had a huge influx of deals that we signed. April, May, and June, we actually closed double the amount of deals that we closed in January, February, March. Again, I think sort of, you know, some momentum in let's get this done sooner rather than later, because we don't know what the next 6 to 9 to 12 months is going to look like. So it was a productive time for us. You know, fortunately, we are a direct investor as well as a syndicator. We were able to continue doing business, and we had made that decision. So things didn't slow down in terms of the desire to close and the desire to sign more business. It was more on, process and what the newer deals might look like. So there was definitely a call to, let's keep this moving as quick as we can while we know what we have.
Right, right.
Yeah, same for me. I mean, I think you're right, Gail. All those LOIs that you were negotiating became a little easier to execute because there is a fear, and you don't have an LOI in place that an investor might not be there, when things get even tougher. Yeah, I think also, we continued to close our deals that we're closing. I think there was some delay with some projects, but I think a lot of it had to do with funding just being held up because of remote work being shifted and just, things were, systems were changed, and just trying to figure that out. And then also, Pennsylvania was, delayed construction and having to figure that out. In other states, it wasn't necessarily construction, but it was also just figuring out the steps to get to that closing. But as much as it might have delayed it a little, it's still closed within those couple of months, March, April, June. And I think, through those times, I think investors started to think a little bit more about how they would approach these periods, right? Like, the March through June was, the reaction to the initial onset of COVID. And then, I'm sure we're going to talk about it in the next slide, but, what would happen next? Like, how would we deal with the next phase of this crazy COVID period? So I think there's a lot of foundation laying.
Right.
You can say.
So we'll go ahead and move on to our next time period. And Michelle, did you want to add anything about early COVID that you saw?
No, I was just going to say, I think fortunately, I didn't hear of anybody having an investor sort of bail or dramatically change terms during that time. I mean, I know personally, I only know of one investor that even threw it out there as sort of a threat that there's a possibility of things changing. So I think as an industry, everyone kind of held strong to their original terms.
Yeah. So anybody in our audience that might be new to the LIHTC industry, just this is a good testament to how, you're hearing it firsthand of just the experience of the industry, the history that it has, and, the success of it, and how, we, like Gail said, the industry does pivot and just moves forward through any, we've been through a lot of challenges in the last few years. So anybody in the audience that might, be in the affordable housing, but not necessarily LIHTC, just, giving you some comfort there. We move forward, right? So moving on to our, we call our next section of our discussion, current COVID. And when we started planning this, we were in December. And so we were thinking about the current period, maybe from that, midsummer, July to December of 2020. How did things start to change? I think in everybody's mind, COVID started settling in. We knew this was sort of a reality that was staying for a little bit, not like in March that we thought, oh, it's 2 weeks and we'll go back to the office, right? So how did things start changing? And we have a few questions up on our screen, so we'll try to tackle these as part of the discussion. But some of the things we talked about in planning the session was, changes in investor appetite. Changes in how investors looked at deals and their due diligence process. And then, things that, the developers should be aware of. And, when they're negotiating a deal, what changed in the industry. So just going to kind of throw it out there, and whoever wants to start can go ahead and kind of see.
I guess I'll start. So as a syndicator, we work with multiple investors. So every investor has their own nuances and how they approached COVID in this phase, right? July through December. I think in that first phase, there were some investors that slowed down on new deals, not necessarily old deals. They continued closing their old deals. So these new deal, so I guess they kind of stepped back, kind of assessed where they were and started to come back in July through December and back into business, as we would say. I think what changed though is requirements. You know, there might have been more, they wanted to look at the developer a little bit more, meaning, are they experienced? Do they have strong financial statements? Also at budgets, reserves, are they there? Interestingly enough, I think, you know, there was some change in how investors looked at rental subsidies, where at one point, you know, there was a huge focus, especially if there was many, it was, you know, if there were many Section 8s involved in a project, the overhang became a big deal, and, you know, investors were a little squeamish about that. I think through COVID, I think they learned having some rental subsidy in these buildings really kind of made a difference, especially with rent collections, you know. So I think they looked at them in a more positive ways. So, you know, it also depends on the investor. I think the other piece is, you know, even some really strong developers that have been doing this for years, strong financial statements, also had a hard time getting exceptions to policy, which normally would have been a lot easier. I think, you know, people, you know, investors were looking for the standard, you know, guarantees, standard reserves, standard projects, and we're very hesitant on giving any kind of exception to any kind of policy on any of their projects, regardless of how strong the developer was. So that, I think, made a difference. You know, negotiating these deals was a little different, I think, from that end. And then, you know, I think there was a better understanding of what to expect. Like, we could still work. These projects could still move forward even after, you know, construction sites were delayed, closing of construction sites. It could still work, you know. So I think investors were a little less weary as they were in that first phase. Yeah, I don't know, Gail, I'm sure you saw some as well.
Yeah, so again, we're a little bit of a hybrid here because we're a direct investor for the balance sheet and also a syndicator. We didn't see much of a drop in investor appetite for a syndication group. I think there were some smaller investors that decided to pull back more because they were uncertain about, you know, either what their financials were going to look like or what the industry was going to look like. But for the most part, investors set their goals either at the end of the previous year or at the beginning of the year. And many of our investors wanted to fulfill those goals. So we sort of kept on target with our multi-investor fund, with our proprietary investors. Nobody pulled back there. We had a fortunate opportunity as PNC Bank early in the year, so well, sort of during COVID, in that we had a huge capital gain event. And with that, we were given directive to go out and buy product, continue buying what we could, as much as we could, that would deliver benefits in 2020 and 2021 to help offset that capital gain. So we were in a very fortunate position during COVID. So, you know, there wasn't much of a drop in investor appetite, and we were fortunate that we actually got to increase our appetite. In terms of what the investors were now looking for, though, did change. Number one, everyone wanted to know what COVID procedures were going to be in place for lease up, for inspections, for construction. So everybody had to go back and write down what they were going to implement immediately. So that was the first request that the investors had. The second one was, let's take a deeper dive into the sponsor's liquidity. What does their portfolio look like, and what happens if they lose a certain percentage of income in their portfolio? Because again, we don't know what the long-term effects of this was going to be on the operations of the project. So we took a deeper dive into financials and liquidity and sponsorship. And then we also started looking at the pro formas for the developments. Number one, we started adding a little bit more into, we didn't add more to the budget, but we stressed the budget a lot more for cost overruns, for delays in construction, for delays in lease up. And was there enough money held back? Was there enough sponsorship to basically get through even more extenuating circumstances than we typically assume? And then we also looked at lease up, AMI growth. So we all know AMI growth is staggered by the time you have, from when you have an event to when you actually see the impact to AMIs. And the industry standard is to assume 2% rent growth every year, unless you've got subsidy. So we started looking at AMIs. What happens, and stressing those, what happens if there is no rent growth in the next 2 years or 2 years from now due to this event? What does that look like? During that period of time, or really as of March, we have seen a huge number of 4% tax exempt bond deals that are unsubsidized. And those were the ones that really took the most scrutiny. If you're underwriting to 60% AMI, max tax credits, and assuming 2% rent growth, is that really feasible given the events of this year? And those are the ones that we scrutinized much more significantly than going forward with a subsidized deal. So those were the things that changed during this time as to how we look at deals.
Great, thanks for those. Are really good. That's really good feedback for the developers to know. And then Michelle, did you want to chime in here? We have a couple of questions in the queue, but I'll give Michelle a minute to just kind of share her thoughts to this time period. And then we'll tackle some of the questions that are in the chat.
Sure. So, we talked about force majeure in early COVID, where, we were revisiting it for the very first time. In this more current period, it started to sort of coalesce and shake out as sort of an industry norm, where there was a new definition of force majeure. It is going to cover things like COVID, or, heaven forbid, there's another pandemic down the road, that this kind of stuff was going to be captured. But it looked a little bit different. In those early deals, we added a force majeure definition that kind of captured COVID, pandemic, government shutdown type events. But in this next phase, it was pulled back a little bit. There were caps on it. I would say most force majeure provisions didn't allow for anything to go beyond 90 days, the original schedule. And they can't put the tax credits at risk. Those were, frequent caveats. But that being said, there are still investors who didn't want force majeure provisions, or they don't have force majeure that covers COVID. So in those cases, in particular, you really had to look at your construction schedule and your timeline to make sure, everything to get you to that place and service date were going to line up. The other thing you started to see in documents that didn't happen in the early ones that closed is provisions about COVID compliance, to make sure that the developer and all the other parties that they contract with follow all applicable rules, guidelines, state, suggestions, et cetera. That went into the documents. The other thing that went in is, I think someone already talked about the plans. What are your COVID plans? And then I'd say most documents also started COVID reporting, monthly reports. And I looked it up just to make sure I'd highlight what they included. So it was sort of any existing or potential work stoppages, problems with procuring materials and supplies, any sort of notices that have come out that's going to impact anything on the deal, like from a government agency, your assessment about cost overruns related to COVID, and then if you have any knowledge or insight about potential closures. So suddenly, you're doing a lot more reporting than you already were doing as a developer. And then as the timeline progressed, recall we were originally supposed to have all deals closed in Pennsylvania by the end of May. And these were 19 credits or forward allocations of 20 credits that had been given out in 19. But as folks were looking at extending their construction timeline to sort of account for COVID, restrictions on how many workers on site or how close they could be together so that you had to stagger trades more, et cetera, people began to get even more nervous about their timeline and making placed in service. So this kind of culminated in PHFA issuing a memorandum in October about, what to do if you needed to exchange credits and the placed in service deadlines and the extensions, et cetera. So there was finally like official word from PHFA on the process and what could be done.
Great. Go ahead and throw out some of the questions from the audience, and we're getting some really good questions. The first question that came in was, how have projects fared with staying on budget? And did you see cost savings due to remote work or additional costs to meet COVID standards? Don't know if anybody wants to take that question.
Well, I can start. We actually did not see any significant cost overruns on construction. We did have some, but we typically do see some. So there wasn't anything significant that stood out to us. Again, and supply chain issues, nothing significant portfolio wide. Some appliances, for some reason, refrigerators were in short supply. So we often heard about that. But in terms of budget, there were a few instances for sure. You're never going to come out of this clean without any instances, but not a major impact on the portfolio. And in terms of cost savings due to remote work, I don't know if that's on a project or on a corporate level. Certainly corporately, we have seen some cost savings because of a lot less travel, a lot less marketing expenses, a lot fewer bottles of bourbon. At the projects themselves, I don't have a measurement here, but I haven't heard that there have been cost savings.
Yeah, same here, Gail. I think it was fairly standard in regards to budgets. We didn't really see anything, too crazy. I think it's, most within what we expect of, within our portfolio as well of, there's some construction delays, there's some cost of increase, but in general, nothing too specific. Same. We didn't have refrigerator problems, but we had cabinet problems. So supply cabinets were low, I guess. And I think also, I did hear some more on those buildings that were already operating from our asset management, that we saw some increase in COVID kind of standards that buildings were putting in place on the operating budget. But again, it was slight, and it wasn't across the board. So, but it was there. And definitely on the corporate side, I'm sure we saw some cost savings, definitely on travel, and so on and so forth. So not very different than what you saw, Gail.
And another question that we have in the queue, we have two, and they're kind of go with each other, but somebody was asking that they didn't meet their lease up schedule goal. Did you see a lot of this happening, or did you guys experience this? And maybe how, from the syndicator investor side, and working with your developers, how was this handled? Was there some leniency, some forgiveness? And then adjusters, kind of what was the effect on it, maybe on adjusters for capital contributions?
We're not there yet for most of our projects, to be completely honest. I think in the next 6 months we'll be there, but there with some that will have some delays, and definitely adjuster. It's just a conversation we're just not ready to have because the building is still in construction. And I think, it's hard to have that conversation with our investors until we have solid, numbers to discuss. So, I mean, it doesn't really answer the question, but it's just the reality that we are in right now. It's just the timing. I think in the next 6 months, we'll probably have more and more of these conversations. But right now, it's really the conversation we're having is we really need to wait and see where the building, where the building will really end up. And then we can start having the conversations.
Yes, and likewise here. And I remember, I think I actually asked that question of a panel a couple of months ago where there were some direct investors, and they gave a very similar answer. They said, we're not seeing this yet, so we really don't have a specific answer as to how we're going to address it. I think, this, like other issues that come up, it's a deal by deal basis. As a developer, you should be aware of where your deal was placed, whether it was with a direct investor, with a proprietary investor, meaning you went through a syndicator and that syndicator worked with one investor, or it's in a multi-investor fund, because the investors have different say over things. So, multi-investor fund may be a little bit more difficult to get approval. If you're working with a direct investor or proprietary investor, may be an easier conversation to have. And again, every situation is different. What that delayed lease up really means in terms of yield and credit delivery to the investor is different. So it's a conversation that you should be having, but there has not been a lot of this in the industry yet, namely because the credit delivery is not defined until your first year tax return, right? So you can say, I'm anticipating this and start the conversation, but the investors are likely not going to give you an answer until they know exactly what the year looked like in operations and credit delivery. And that won't be until February or March, whenever your financials and your tax return are done.
So stay tuned.
Yeah. Good. And then Michelle, there's a question in the queue that maybe you can give us a little more insight to. There's a question about any feedback from PHFA on how it would handle potential place and service deadline extensions for projects awarded 9% credits last year and expected to close this year, with anticipated completion dates close to or before 12/31/22. So I don't know if some of your experience working with developers in PA.
So I don't know if they're talking about still the 2019 round of reservations. For that, I'd go to PHFA's website. They have a memo that was issued in October, specifically with respect to deals that, recently closed or are still trying to close out of that round, because that's where we're really starting to get into issues. PHFA is willing to exchange credits. They're charging half of the normal fee at this point, but they don't want to entertain that request until you're within 60 days of closing. I don't think that anyone's really looking yet at the deals that were awarded in August of 2020 as having placed in service issues. I think, those are under guidelines from PHFA that they have to close by the end of July. So I haven't really heard anxiety yet about that deadline or placed in service out of that round.
Okay. And then before we move on to, what you guys think about the future, because we all know what's going to happen tomorrow. This year and 2020, 2021 just brings surprises every day. But anything else, Michelle, particularly, did you want to add anything about PHFA and developers and kind of dealing with the delays of COVID year?
For the current period, no. I mean, are we moving on to the?
Yeah. Okay. We'll move on then.
Okay.
And so where we are today, we're just looking at, what you guys are seeing for the future. We discussed some underwriting, and due diligence changes. what do we expect those to continue onto deals in the future, right? Sometimes things like this happen and things change, but we never forget. And so, as particularly investors are very concerned. So, do they expect that, they continue to look at deals more stringently? And then looking at PHFA changes as well. So I don't know, Michelle, do you want to talk first on this one since we
Sure. I think, some of the lessons learned is just the lack of just knowing what's going to happen. I think one of the big problems that happened for developers was site control. Nobody, when PHFA had a deadline of closing by the end of May, you didn't necessarily have site control of your property beyond that date or, too tremendously far past that date. So if you were buying property from maybe a governmental agency, that wasn't necessarily a problem. They were willing to extend, but there are certainly instances where private third parties were selling property and developers had to make a choice of acquiring property early or losing it, or to continue to pay really high sums of money as demand for ongoing option fees kind of increased costs for developers beyond what they really wanted to. So I think going forward, as hard as it is sometimes to secure a piece of property as it is under guidelines, maybe you want to try to negotiate that site control to give it to you for a little bit longer. I do note in the current round, if you're applying for 21 credits in Pennsylvania, the site control requirement with the application is through the end of this year, but you already have to build in that if you get it, you have 2 weeks to trigger site control through the end of 2022. So I think PHFA is sort of proactively addressing that a little bit to try to have you upfront have a longer site control. And I think, to some extent, we had a little bit of a perfect storm going on with PA only doing one round and all the developers having to close by a date certain. At the beginning, I said, everybody was already sort of under feeling the pressure to get closed by the end of May before COVID happened. And I think there was a lot of angst as to whether or not that was actually going to happen and what would be the effects. So with everybody already all bunched up and there already being issues, and then they're layering COVID on top of it, I think PHFA is trying to eliminate some of that going forward. I know in the August 2020 round, they made developers give a certification saying that they and their team members all understood all of PHFA's rules, including the July 30th closing deadline. I know it went out to attorneys and contractors, architects and engineers. Sort of interesting to be given PHFA's policies and say you'll agree, up front, but that's something that's in place. And I think, the other thing that's interesting right now from my practice and, to Christina's point of when does my phone ring, sort of the hidden gem out of COVID was, December 27th when the 4% rate was fixed. So I'm working on a deal right now. And as far as I know, we don't have official PHFA guidelines unless that has changed since the last phone conversation with my developer. But how do you switch from the floating rate to the fixed rate? For those deals that were close to closing at the end of the year and we're moving forward now, what happens there? And probably that makes the 4% deal in PA a lot more attractive than it historically has been.
Yes, very true. Yeah, I think along those lines, investors, I think, those that may have taken a slight break are all back. But again, they're taking a closer look at the developers, their experience, and so on and so forth. I think also the 4% fix will have some effect, particularly in Pennsylvania, interest in, what projects they decide to take on. But I also think there needs to be I think there's also another workshop that will delve into this, but it will have an effect. And I think the perception from both the developer and investor right now is probably not aligned. And it'll be interesting just how it kind of comes together in the end on projects. More equity. What does that mean for pricing? It's not necessarily going to go up, but it might go down depending on how you look at the project. But there's more equity, available for these projects. So it'll be interesting to see how they pan out at the end. In regards to COVID around underwriting, again, it's, I think, investors will really just be paying attention to those line items in the construction budget, as well as operating expenses and any reserves. I think all of those are kind of key points in any project moving forward. As much as, we've been through these last couple of phases of this COVID conversation we've had and have lived through, there is still some, caution out there from investors, meaning just, they're paying attention to timing and potential risks on projects, but doesn't mean they're not doing projects, and doesn't mean that they're not trying to give competitive pricing as well. So overall, I think it'll be telling how the industry kind of takes on this next phase. And there's a lot going on, at the 4% VIX, and then other potential changes in the future with a new president coming into office. So I think time will tell. But overall, I think the industry is just as strong as it was. And I think Gail mentioned it early on, just, we're a strong industry. We've grown, we're mature, and we continue to want to do this work, and we see the value in it.
I'll just add some comments as well, about volume of LIHTC. So we have not gotten a good amount of feedback from our third-party investors on what 2021 is going to look like for them. So I think that there are still some on the fence, still trying to understand what the impact of last year had on their financial statements and revenue, and what impact that might have in their buying of tax credits. But we are in unprecedented times. And as I said earlier, I mean, we can shift and we pivot and we do a great job. There is always a huge need for affordable housing. And this program is not going to go away. And there needs to be investment. But some of the other things that have happened this year have, I think, changed the mindset too of some investors. So yes, we need investment in this housing to make it happen, because this is the most productive program we've ever had. But there's also another component to this housing, and that's the social impact that we're making on low and moderate and diverse communities. And that has really come to the forefront as well. So while we may see some investors that are typically investing for CRA needs take a pause, or maybe pull back a little bit, or come with even more requests, we are having this other wave of investors come in that really want to make a social impact. So I see the volume increasing. And I think it's not just because of COVID, it's because of all the other social impact events that we had this year. Will the underwriting changes that we've looked at still become incorporated? It's hard to say. It's always a demand. If it's a very competitive deal, then those underwriting requirements tend to change a little bit. But we're always looking to make sure that this housing is preserved and will survive 15 years. So if that means more operating reserves, more conservative underwriting on growth in rents, we're going to do that. As I said, when there's more competition in the market, some of those requirements that have been incorporated in the last 6 months will ease up. And so that's yet to see. But the whole intention of this is to make sure that these developments are being done where it's most needed, and that they survive the 15 years.
Yeah, I think that all the comments you guys have made have been really helpful for our developers and just kind of outlook for the industry. And like you said, the social impact. I think developers, presenting those deals, those ones that are going to be, extra attractive as well as to the state housing agencies are those that show that they can make an impact right now. That's one of the big pushes that has been highlighted because of COVID and all the changes of, the inequities. So I think those deals that continue to show that they're really making a change in their community are going to be looked at more favorably as well from investors and agencies also. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have a couple of questions that we can take. I'm going to go ahead and if we can show our gallery so we can see all our panelists at one time. I'm going to stop share of my screen. Let's see if this works. Hopefully our audience is seeing all our panelists at once now. We'll go ahead and maybe address one or two more questions that are in the queue. We have a question about how do you see COVID-19 impacting year 15 and year 30 properties? For example, do you project owners selling properties and a potential loss of affordability? Have we seen any uptick in dispositions, or I think that's where the question is going?
From my clients, I could just say that I don't see any change in sort of the long-term strategy. I think they're still looking at investor exits at year 15 or whatever the appropriate, increment is, but I don't really see anyone looking to sell who wasn't before. I mean, that being said, I didn't do any year 15 dispositions during COVID. I had a couple deals that probably could have done it in a normal time frame. They would have thought about a December 31 exit, and sort of to what Gail was saying, the investors just aren't ready. They don't know what their portfolios look like, what the impact of COVID is yet. So everybody sort of said, come back the end of January and let's talk again.
Yeah, I think we do a lot of dispositions. We didn't necessarily see a slowdown, but the dispositions that we did were not to market rate developers. There appeared to be such short demand for affordable housing preservation deals that there was a lot of money out there looking to preserve housing. There was a blip, definitely, where cap rates were questionable, and there were not a lot of transactions happening. And I think people took a step back from putting opportunities on the market. But what I do see is there's a lot of capital looking to preserve affordable housing. So I didn't see much, if any, that I can think of converting to market. But I do see a really high demand on preservation of affordable housing.
Yeah, same here. Didn't see much of a change through COVID, but I think, I think as well, I think the key thing is to preserve housing in the future. So.
And we have a question on the hot topic of income averaging. Are you seeing investors pushing back because of the income averaging IRS guidance and what's going on there?
We are, yes. A few of our investors have said we're just going to take a pause until there's more guidance. For our own balance sheet, we are still buying them, but we're making sure there's enough of a buffer. Below 60% average AMI, we're looking for 57, 58%. There are a number of things outside of COVID that are affecting underwriting, and income averaging is one of them. That's something that the whole industry really pushed for, and now we're confused about it. The 4% rate lock is just going to be a blip for the next few months, and that will have a huge impact. But the IRS putting forth guidance that we can't go back and amend tax returns has been a huge issue, particularly on AC rehab deals. Going to see that come into play in underwriting and partnership agreements. And also the delay in receipt of 8609s is coming into play. So there are issues outside of COVID that are affecting the underwriting and the deal terms in these deals.
Can't ever sit back in this industry. So you got to stay on your toes. I just want to thank you all for joining us today. And if you had any last comments, I think we have a couple minutes to share, but I just want to be able to give everybody our chance to say thank you to our panelists for sharing a lot of the very intimate details about how they look at deals. So thank you very much. I think it's super helpful to everybody and to our audience. So if anybody wanted to add anything before we close.
No, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah,
It's a fun discussion.
Yeah.
Great,
Thank you, Christine, and everybody in the organization.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. All right. Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
You too.